What if I told you that the most powerful empire in history wasn't built by kings, emperors, or generals, but by a corporation? Not the mafia. Not the cartels. A company. A business with shareholders, a logo, and a London office address. Yet this company conquered vast kingdoms, ruled over millions of people, manipulated politicians, staged wars, and left behind a legacy of exploitation and empire. It wasn't just business. It was a conspiracy, a very British conspiracy. Tonight, we dive deep into the origins, the plots, and the shadowy manipulations of the East India Company. A tale of greed, betrayal, and conspiracy that changed the world forever. The birth of a company. The year is 1600. London is still a rough, smoky city, ruled by Queen Elizabeth I. Across the world, a spice trade is booming. Nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper, tiny things we sprinkle on food today, were worth their weight in gold back then. Whoever controlled spices controlled wealth itself. But the Portuguese and Dutch had already cornered the trade. England, a rising naval power, wanted in. So, on the last day of December 1600, Elizabeth I signed a royal charter giving a group of London merchants exclusive rights to trade with the East Indies. That group called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Quite a mouthful. History would remember them simply as the East India Company. But here's the twist, this wasn't just about commerce. From the very beginning, the company was tangled with politics and power. Its backers weren't just shopkeepers. They were nobles, parliamentarians, and even royalty. Behind its trading face, the company was a political weapon. A conspiracy in corporate form. In its early years, the company struggled. The Dutch East India Company, better armed, better financed, beat them to the best ports. Portuguese forts loomed across Asia. But the English merchants were patient, and they knew something others didn't: to succeed, they couldn't just trade. They had to infiltrate. So slowly, they wormed their way into India, not as conquerors at first, but as humble traders. They requested tiny pieces of land to build trading posts, which they called factories. They bowed before the mighty Mughal emperors, who at the time ruled a vast, prosperous, and sophisticated empire. The Mughals thought the English were minor players, hardly worth noticing. But behind the silks and courtesies, the company was already planning its conspiracy. For the company's true ambition wasn't just to trade goods, it was to rule lands. From traders to conspirators. Let's pause here and picture India in the 1700s. This was not a poor land waiting to be civilized, as the British would later claim. India under the Mughals was one of the richest regions in the world. Its textiles, silk, and spices were prized everywhere. Its agriculture sustained millions. Its architecture stunned visitors. The English weren't bringing civilization, they were chasing profit. And to profit, they needed more than trade. They needed control. So how do you take control of a land where you are vastly outnumbered, where powerful armies and rulers dominate? You don't fight them head-on. You conspire. The company began to master the dark art of manipulation, bribing officials, exploiting rivalries, funding wars between Indian princes. Divide and rule, long before it became a colonial cliché. And then came 1757, the moment that changed everything. The Battle of Plassey. On paper, it looked impossible. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, commanded nearly 50,000 soldiers. Robert Clive, leading the company's forces, had barely 3,000. It should have been a massacre. But what the Nawab didn't know was that half his generals had already been bought. Mir Jafar, commander of the Nawab's army, had secretly struck a deal with the company. He would betray his own master in exchange for being installed as a puppet ruler. So, as the cannons roared, much of the Nawab's army simply stood still. Within hours, Bengal fell, not because of strength, but because of conspiracy. Robert Clive returned to Britain as a hero. But make no mistake, this was not a victory of honor. It was the world's first corporate coup. A handful of merchants in London had, through bribery and betrayal, seized control of Bengal, the richest province in India, home to millions. From that moment, the East India Company was no longer just a trading business. It was a shadow government. A corporate empire. A company that ruled. After Plassey, the company transformed almost overnight. It was no longer just a trading venture, it had become a kingdom in all but name. But here's the strange part, it wasn't a king or a queen that ruled Bengal. It was a boardroom in London. Imagine this, a group of merchants, sitting around polished wooden tables thousands of miles away, deciding the fate of millions of Indians. A private corporation, run for profit, was now collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and commanding armies. Bengal became the company's golden goose, and they squeezed it mercilessly. They raised taxes to unbearable levels. Farmers were forced to abandon food crops to grow indigo and opium, which the company exported for enormous profit. And while fortunes flowed into London, famine stalked Bengal. In 1770, famine struck Bengal. Crops failed, but the company refused to reduce taxes or release stored grain. Instead, they auctioned food to the highest bidder, prioritizing profit over human lives. The result? Nearly 10 million people died, 1/3 of Bengal's population wiped out. And while the people starved, the company's shareholders back in Britain grew rich. Dividends soared. For them, famine was not a tragedy, it was business. Even in Britain, the stench of corruption was overwhelming. Company officials returned from India with obscene wealth, known as nabobs, new aristocrats who bought estates, bribed politicians, and flaunted their fortunes. They were accused of looting India, of bringing home blood-soaked riches. Satirical cartoons mocked them as greedy pigs feeding off the misery of millions. The scandal grew so loud that Parliament had to step in. The Regulating Act of 1773 tried to rein in the company's excesses. Warren Hastings, the company's first Governor-General of India, was even impeached in a dramatic trial, accused of tyranny and corruption. But the truth? These reforms barely scratched the surface. The conspiracy of profit was too deeply entrenched. By the late 18th century, the East India Company wasn't just ruling Bengal. It had conquered large swathes of India through war, treaties, and manipulation. Its private army, over 250,000 strong, was larger than the standing army of Britain itself. Just think about that, a corporation with more soldiers than the King of England. And yet, this army wasn't used for defense. It was used for expansion. Kingdom after kingdom fell under company control, either through the sword, or through clever diplomacy that left Indian rulers as mere puppets. Whenever resistance arose, the company crushed it with brutal force. But the company's conspiracies weren't limited to India. In China, they engineered one of the darkest trades in history, the opium trade. Farmers in India were forced to grow opium, which the company then smuggled into China, addicting millions. When the Chinese government resisted, the company, backed by the British state, dragged China into the infamous Opium Wars. Think about that for a second, a private company had the power to start wars between nations. All in the name of profit. The fall of the conspiracy. But every empire built on conspiracy and exploitation eventually faces resistance. For the East India Company, the breaking point came in 1857. The spark was small. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, discovered that their new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindus and Muslims alike, this was a religious outrage. When ordered to bite the cartridges open, many refused. But this was just the trigger. Behind it lay decades of anger, high taxes, land seizures, cultural disrespect, and brutal rule. In May 1857, the sepoys revolted. The mutiny spread like wildfire. From Delhi to Kanpur to Lucknow, Indians rose against the company. At first, the company was caught off guard. The rebels captured Delhi and declared the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their symbolic leader. For a brief moment, it looked as if the company's empire was collapsing. But the company, backed by reinforcements from Britain, fought back with merciless brutality. Entire cities were burned. Rebels were executed in public spectacles. Civilians suspected of aiding the uprising were massacred. The violence shocked the world. The rebellion lasted more than a year, but by 1858, it was crushed. And with it, so was the company. The British government decided that a private corporation could no longer be trusted to rule such vast lands. The East India Company was dissolved. Its armies, territories, and debts were transferred directly to the Crown. The British Raj was born. The company's 250-year reign had ended. But the conspiracy it represented, the marriage of business, politics, and empire, was far from over. Legacy of the conspiracy. So what did the East India Company leave behind? For India, centuries of plunder. Economists estimate that trillions of dollars worth of wealth were drained from India to Britain. India, once a center of global trade, was reduced to poverty under colonial rule. Famines became routine. Traditional industries collapsed. For Britain, the company's loot fueled the Industrial Revolution. The cotton mills of Manchester ran on Indian cotton. The banks of London swelled with Indian wealth. And the British Empire, often celebrated in history books, was built on the back of a corporate conspiracy. But perhaps the company's greatest legacy is more subtle. It pioneered something we now take for granted, the multinational corporation. It showed how a business could manipulate politics, lobby governments, raise private armies, and even start wars, all for profit. Sound familiar? Today, corporations don't raise private armies, at least not openly. But they do lobby governments, influence wars, and shape economies. Oil companies, tech giants, pharmaceutical empires, many of them wield power over nations in ways eerily similar to the East India Company. The conspiracy never truly ended. It simply changed form. The East India Company was the very British conspiracy that devoured a subcontinent. It proved that a company could act as an empire, that profit could justify any cruelty, and that the line between business and politics could vanish. Its shadow still lingers in our world today. The question is, have we escaped its ghost, or are we still living in its empire, disguised under new names?